Chapter 14 Man of War. War. The time before the deluge saw many great wars, with the savage giants fighting each other for suzerainty, hegemony, or sometimes merely malicious amusement. As a result of this, their world had been destroyed, and the Eternal had given through Noah the command that one was neither to kill another human, nor eat the blood of animals. But the kings and princes of the earth defied the Eternal and his covenant, and made war with themselves, nevertheless. Now war was come to the land of Canaan, a war of hegemony and taxation. For 13 years, the cities of the plain had stood in open rebellion against Chedorlaomer, the lord of the Elamites. In the intermittent years, the Elamites raided the lands on the eastern side of the river Jordan, slaughtering the giants where they found them. Perhaps Chedorlaomer hoped to cow the cities of the plain back into submission with a show of force against even a more powerful foe. In recent years, the battle was taken to the southern side, as far as En-Mishpat and the land of the Amorites. Messages from Mamre and his brothers came monthly to Kiryat Arba and Shechem, where the son of Terah was known to sojourn, calling for him to fulfill his part of their covenant and join them in their war with the Elamites. But Abram refused to answer them. He was a man of peace and determined to maintain neutrality in this conflict. By now, he knew the lands around Shechem and Kiryat Arba, and would often retire his people into the caves of the mountains if there was rumor that forces were making their way through the pasture land. Though Abram was not a soldier, he was not ignorant to the ways of warfare. The Mizraim servants told of the many wars their pharaohs had with the 9 bows, the enemies of their land. Always drastic measures were taken in such war, and the victors despoiled their prey in the most rapine and vile manner. As he was determined to keep the 7 laws of Noah's covenant, Abram saw that going to war with the Amorites would break the prohibition on killing. One afternoon, he was in the camp with some of the younger servants, telling them in animated terms the story of creation. He was come to the 6th day, just before the Eternal made man, when one of his servants came running into the center of the camp. On his arm was a gray-headed and bearded old man, whose face was crestfallen, and whose arms were covered in blood. Abram rose from his place, taking up his staff, and dismissed the young ones. He then called for Sarai to bring water as he approached the servant. "My lord master," the servant said, "I found this man in the fields near the goat pasture. He says that he knows you." Abram approached the old man and lifted his head. A look of horror appeared on Abram's face. "Oni," he said, "what's happened?" "He can't talk, my lord," the servant replied. "He collapsed on me as soon as I saw him. I thought I'd bring him to you." "Sarai, hurry with the water," Abram called back. He then took Oni from the servant and thanked him for his service. With one hand under Oni's arms and the other on his staff, he brought the old man back to his own tent and seated him upon the rug. Sarai appeared momentarily, with Hagar behind her carrying a goat's skin of water, which Abram took and gave for Oni to drink. The poor old man devoured the water greedily, sending drips of it falling down his beard until he coughed, sputtered, and finally began to breathe in ragged gasps. At last, he began to speak.
"Fear, blood, foes, death,"
were all he could mutter at first. Abram gave him more water and had Sarai prepare food for the old man. This Sarai did herself. While the servants made good food, she believed no one in the camp precisely knew how to make bread and fig cakes quite like her. After a while, she came back with a flat cake of bread, which Abram broke and gave to Oni to eat. After he had eaten and drunk again from the water skin, he finally had enough strength to speak.
"The Elamites attacked,"
he began.
They're not alone either. They have Amraphel with them, and Arioch of Elasar, and Tishtal the Hurrian, 800,000 in all. The 5 kings of the cities of the plain met them on the field of battle. In the Wadi Shittim, they had the high ground and drove us into the mud pits. It was a slaughter. Visha was cut down by Chedorlaomer. Shinab fell to the spear of Arioch. Shemeber to the sword of Amraphel. And the arrows of the Hurrian nations felled the king of Bela. What happened then?
Abram asked.
The Elamites plundered the cities of the plain,
Oni answered.
They said they would take 13 years of tribute by force. Gold, silver, precious stones, silk, spices, cattle, sheep, goats, men, women, children.
Wait, Abram interjected. You said men, women, and children. What has become of Lot?
My lord and his family were taken captive,
Oni gasped.
He sent me to tell you of what happened, and I barely escaped the Elamites with my life.
Abram gasped, burying his face in his hands. Behind him, from the tent, the sound of Sarai weeping could be heard. Those who were prisoners were certainly either dead or sure to suffer a terrible fate. The fate of prisoners of war quelling a rebellion was not a happy one in these parts. But now Abram was forced into a corner. At one point, he could violate his covenant with Lot and so lose the only hope of the Eternal's promise being fulfilled, since he still had no children. Or uphold his covenant with Lot and likely bring the wrath of the Eternal upon him for shedding blood. For blood would surely have to be shed in order to save Lot from the Elamites.
Where are they now?
Abram asked.
They're on their way north,
Oni replied.
Likely to enter the safety of Baalbek,
Abram mused. He then thanked Oni for telling him and had some of his other servants give him a place to rest in his tent until he was ready to leave. Abram then summoned Eleazar to his side.
I have a task for you, my faithful Eleazar,
Abram said.
I am about to go to war with the Elamites to rescue Lot. But I will need help. I'll rouse the servants here at the camp. I need you to go into the mountains and have Mamre and his brothers meet me at my camp.
Yes, my lord, Eleazar bowed. Eleazar was given the fastest camel to take him into the dwelling places of the Amorite leaders, while Abram had all the servants of his house gathered before his tent. He then had 2 servants bring before them the chest of gold and jewels that had once hidden Sarai from the people of Mizraim.
My beloved servants,
Abram said to them,
you have followed me for half a jubilee of years and one over. Some of you knew me in Ur and know how I behaved toward you. You know also how I gave you the choice to remain in Padan, and you stayed with me again. Now, I am going to war with the Elamites to rescue my nephew Lot. If we win, you will likely expect some additional reward for your service.
He then opened the chest and showed them the gold.
This is your reward, he told them. Gold for each one of you who fights. But we will take nothing for ourselves from the plunder of our enemies, nor accept any reward from the kings of the cities of the plain for our warfare. Your reward awaits for you at home, not in the hands of a Sodomite. Now, let all those who are willing to fight ready themselves for battle.
No fewer than 318 were there among Abram's servants, who were of fighting age and not too old to be useless. Each one of them, Abram had armed themselves with weapons while they waited for the arrival of the Amorites. They had staves for themselves, which were fastened with bronze tips and turned into spears. Many of them also had slings, with which they used to drive off wolves and lions from the flocks. The eldest of the servants had bows for themselves, and arrows to shoot from them. Only Eleazar had a knife for himself, apart from his staff. Abram bore also the dagger that his father Terah had given him at their final parting. About evening, Eleazar's camel was seen on the horizon. Behind him rode the chieftains of the Amorites, each of them with bows upon their backs and swords and axes upon their thighs. They dismounted as soon as they appeared and approached Abram. Mamre bore a grim expression as he approached the Lord of the Hebrews.
"For these long months," he said, "you have failed to come to our aid when the Elamites attacked us. Now you finally join the fight?"
"Yes," Abram replied. He hoped that Mamre would not hold a grudge, and that his Amorite sensibilities would be eager to fight with the hated Elamites. Mamre chuckled.
"What took you so long? I've been chopping at the bit to repay Chedorlaomer for his audacity. The Elamites owe me and my people more than an eye, a tooth, an arm, and a leg for what they've done to us." "Then you'll fight with us?" Abram asked. "Truly," Mamre replied. "My brothers and I can muster a force and meet you outside of Shechem by tomorrow. We'll ride through the night if we must."
"Good," Abram returned. "We have to catch the Elamite army before they reach Baalbek." Mamre and his brothers departed immediately to begin the muster of the Amorites, while Abram and his band made ready to leave. Eleazar stood by with a trumpet made of ram's horn, ready to sound and begin the march north. Abram, meanwhile, was giving orders to his wife Sarai.
"While I'm away," he said, "you have charge of the camp. Take care of our increase until we return. If we do not, hide yourself in the mountains for 40 days, or until the word of the Eternal comes to you."
"Must you indeed be off to war, my love?" Sarai asked.
"Have no fear, Sarai," Abram returned. "We go to avenge the capture of Lot and his family. He is still my kin, and may yet be my heir before the Eternal. There is also my oath to him, which I must keep."
"Do not forget to pray to the Eternal for guidance," Sarai said. "You are doing much more than sojourning in Mizraim. Surely you need to ask the Eternal for help in this matter."
"Yes, I shall, Sarai."
Abram smiled. He leaned in and kissed her upon the lips. Then, taking up his staff, he gave Eleazar the word. The horn was sounded, and the small band made their way northward, in hot pursuit of the Elamite army. The journey from Kiryat Arba to Shechem was normally a journey of 2 days, by the normal way of traveling by caravan. But instead, they traveled by day and night, hastened on their way by an intimate knowledge of the land. No bandit would assault them, for they were likely all in hiding with the coming of the Elamites. By going at double-time march, they made the journey from Kiryat Arba to Shechem in only 1 day-night cycle, and so came to rest while they waited for the Amorites. About midday, Mamre arrived at the head of a company of cavalry. His men were armed to the hilt, with spears, maces, and axes, as well as bows and arrows. But as soon as Mamre saw Abram's army, he threw back his head in laughter.
"Do you not wish to engage the Elamites?" he asked. "You bring so small a force to bear upon them. No wonder you haven't joined the battle sooner with so little to contribute to the war effort. Did not Chedorlaomer defeat Nimrod's larger army with a much smaller force?" Abram asked. "Numbers will not always win the day." He looked at Mamre's cavalry. "Your mounted warriors will certainly prove useful in the battle to come." He then chuckled. "What makes you smile, my lord Abram?" Mamre asked. "It is rumored," Abram stated, "that the Amorites are giants. Yet I see none here but men of ordinary stature. Are there indeed giants among the Amorites?" Mamre's expression hardened. "Then that's enough." "Shall we move out then?" Abram asked. Mamre nodded, then gave the order to his cavalry to move out. But as they were on their way, Eleazar came to Abram's side. "My lord," he began, "surely you've noticed that we're outnumbered." "Yes, I know," Abram nodded. "Even if Eshcol and Aner have twice what Mamre has," Eleazar reasoned, "we will only number 900. The Elamites, the Shinari, the
The Elasarim and the Hurrians will outnumber us 1,800 fourscore and 8 to 1.
Yes, Abram repeated. But we have a distinct advantage upon them. We know this land better than they do. Their war wagons will be useless against us in this terrain. And there are other ways that we can level the playing field. By day and night, the small band of warriors made their journey through the wilderness, always heading north. Aner and Eshkol's companies hadn't appeared yet, but Mamre told Abram that his brothers were at the vanguard, sending scouts to take account of the enemy's movements on their march. They rested in brief spells, for Abram was determined to rescue Lot before the Elamites reached Baalbek. If they did, then surely Lot and Ado and their family would die a most cruel death in the name of putting down any potential rebels. Of course, the children, particularly Lot's 2 young girls, would likely be offered up to the Chaldim, or the local Canaanite gods. Whichever ones Amraph or Chedorlaomer chose to honor for their victories. 2 days of marching went on, and still no sign of the army was seen, apart from the rumor of them. They passed around the western shores of the Sea of Kinneret, and continued their way north. The white peaks of Mount Senir began to rise out of the landscape before them, the highest mountains in the region. About midday, an Amorite scout from Eshkol's company rode back to Abram and Mamre's group atop his horse. He brought his mount up to where Abram and Mamre were leading the 2 companies. "My lords," he cried out, "my lords, we found them."
"Praise be the Eternal," Abram cried out.
"Where are they?"
Mamre asked.
"They have made camp before Mount Senir," the scout replied, "just outside the town of Lisha."
"How many are there?" Mamre asked.
"Hundreds of thousands," the scout answered. "The whole valley is full of them."
Mamre turned his horse back around to Abram's camel.
"I long to take the battle to the Elamites and avenge my people's death. But are you still determined to engage them, knowing this?"
"Yes," Abram said.
"We must." "Your pardon, my lord," the scout said to Abram, "but this is not a battle that we can win. I have seen the armies of Chedorlaomer with my own eyes. If we attack, we will be broken and slaughtered. The rules of wars tell us that no captain should engage an enemy in battle unless he intends to win or has no choice. And in this matter, we do have a choice." "You may have a choice, but I do not," Abram replied. "Honor dictates that I engage the Elamites and rescue my brother's son."
Mamre turned to Abram.
"A worthy man indeed. Let's see if you can defend those words with something more substantial."
"My lord," Eleazar, who attended Abram's camel, spoke up, "we are nearing the borders of my country. We should take a view of the Elamite camp. Perhaps we will find something that will offer us an advantage in the battle to come." Together with Abram, Mamre and the scout rode ahead to view the Elamite army. Eleazar went with Abram to attend to the camel. With them also came Aner and Eshkel from their camps. They met on the eastern slopes of the Senir mountain range, behind a hill of rock. Once their mounts were secured, the 4 lords ascended the hill and peeked over to look at the Elamite camp.
"There are so many,"
Abram mused. Not since he was delivered from the fire of Nimrod had he seen so many people in one place.
"So many." "We can take them," Mamre replied. "They've come a long way from the plain of Jordan. They're weary and eager to return to their walled cities. Also, this is Amorite land. We know the land better than they do. At least your Damasek servant does." "Come up here, Eleazar," Abram commanded. "See the enemy camp for yourself."
Eleazar made his way up the rocky hill and peered down upon the Elamite camp. To the surprise of Abram and the Amorite chieftains, he let out a soft chuckle.
"You think this is funny, slave?"
Mamre asked. "See that?" Eleazar said, gesturing to the camp. "They've pitched camp in the worst possible place in these parts. There are mountains on all sides. The heights of Lebanon on the west, and the Senir on the north and east. The only way in or out of that valley is the south."
"You're sure?"
Mamre inquired. "Certain," Eleazar replied. "The heights of the Senir are sometimes capped with snow. The mountains have rigged them in. They're trapped."
"Still, they have numbers on their side," Eshkol added. "They can afford to lose a whole company more than we can afford to lose even one." and we must use our cunning and knowledge of the land to give us the advantage, Abram said. Eleazar, tell me what the camp looks like.
Eleazar looked back over the ridge.
I see only a few perimeter guards, he said. I'm amazed that they have so few guards on their camp. They think themselves safe, having gotten the victory. Did you happen to see where the prisoners are kept?
No, I didn't, Eleazar replied.
But I would assume they keep them in the center of their camp, as far away from escape as possible.
Abram sighed.
It looks like it will be a long struggle either way.
He stroked his beard, then turned to the Amorites.
We must wait for cover of darkness.
By night, we have a better chance of success against greater numbers than by day.
I'll go in first with a third of my men, and we'll get rid of the scouts as we encounter. They'll not have many soldiers watching the north and east, since they trust in the protection of the mountains. Once we're inside, we'll make our way to the prisoners and set them free. Eleazar, my lord, once we breach the perimeter, they'll likely be coming for us. Take 1/3 of my servants and set fire to the tents on the northern side of the camp. Sharum will take the other third and set fire to the east. Mamre, once you see the fires, you and your brothers attack from the south. We'll use your mounted archers to harass the enemy and make them believe that there's attack coming from the south.
We can do that. Mamre nodded, a cocky grin on his face. He and his brothers then went off to relay their orders to the rest of their men. Abram, meanwhile, was ready to return to the camp with Eleazar.
Do what you can to minimize losses, he told his servant. If you are engaged, then you have permission to defend yourselves. But do not seek them out. Remember, we do not have the numbers to engage them directly.
Yes, my lord, Eleazar nodded. They returned to the camp and gave their orders to their groups. The 3 companies were then divided and made their way quietly into the mountains. Then they hid among the rocks and waited for nightfall. Abram periodically looked out to the west to watch the going down of the sun. Once the sphere of light descended into the great sea, they would wait until the world became blanketed in darkness. They would not have to wait very long, and then they would begin their attack. There would be no time to wait, not a single moment for failure or slip-ups. No matter how slight, a single failure would be the end of them. Abram closed his eyes, gripping in his hand the staff of Noah. No, it wasn't his staff anymore, for he was dead. It was now the staff of Abram. Looking at the staff, he remembered its long and storied history, and how it had come down to him from the hands of men who had walked with the eternal God. He remembered also his failure in Mizraim, and chose not to make that same mistake again. He was going to do something much worse now.
Eternal God, he prayed, all my life I have kept the covenant that you gave to Noah. I have never slain a single man, and all the blood of the sacrifices I have returned to you. Now, I am about to break that covenant to rescue my nephew Lot, as I have sworn before you. I go to war now with an enemy whose numbers is many times more than my own host. For the sake of Haran, who embraced you at the last moment, and for the sake of the covenant I made with Lot, the son of Haran, I ask that you grant me victory against the Elamites. Do this for me, and I swear that I shall take no treasure or reward for my valor, be it as small as the strap of a sandal. Let no man say that they have made Abram rich, for it is you who have blessed me with riches and with victory.
Slowly the sun began to sink down, and the shadows in the valley of Lisha grew longer and darker. Abram's group gathered together closely and readied for the attack. The last sliver of golden light vanished behind the mountains in the west, and soon the entire valley was plunged into night. The sky turned from indigo to deep blue, and then to jet black, dotted with stars. It was a moonless night, but not yet the time of the new moon, so there would be significantly less light. This would make moving difficult, but would hide them from their enemy. Abram gripped his staff in one hand and his dagger in the other. The knife that Terah had given him would now be used against Amraphel, the son of Nimrod. As the light was fading, Abram sent those of his company who had bows to seek out and take out any scouts they could find. He chose the sharpest shooters, whose aim could be trusted even in the time of night. Behind them moved Eleazar and Sharum, and the other servants as they took their positions for the lighting of the camps. They would be the second wave of the attack. One by one, the guards fell silently and swiftly. Once their silhouettes could no longer be seen against the flickering lights of the Elamite camp, Abram took his small band of men and made their way into the camp of the Elamites. They moved swiftly, always keeping to the shadows to avoid detection. Abram's heart raced beneath his chest. Any moment, he feared, they would be spotted, and they would lose the element of surprise that they had so preciously won. Any sentries they encountered within the camp they slew, either with a well-placed rock to the head flung from a sling, knocked on the head by a staff, or had their throats slit by the knife of Abram before they could cry out. It was a bloody business, and not at all to the liking of Abram. Killing a precious and healthy one of the flocks was one thing, especially when they were calmly and humanely kept at peace and not shown the object of their death. But killing another human made Abram feel genuinely repulsed. His hands trembled as he felt the hot drops of human blood splatter upon them. It was only the urgency of the moment, his duty to Lot, and the fear of discovery that kept Abram on his feet and moving despite his horror. Just then, the sound of a voice crying out in Hurrian, heard somewhere on the borders of the camp, made Abram's heart froze. They had been discovered. They had lost the element of surprise. He had to move fast, or else they would be surrounded and brought to a swift and brutal end. Suddenly there was another cry, and a burst of light coming from the north. Eleazar had started his work on the tents, but now Abram had another fear in his heart. If the Elamites thought that they were in danger, they might slay the prisoners to keep them from being rescued or to make their flight swifter. "Hurry," he said. "Find the prisoners and free them." He went throughout the camp, looking for anything that might indicate the location of the captives. Another burst of fire came on the outskirts of the camp, this time from the east. Abram continued his way, knife in one hand and staff in the other, looking for the tent. So far he was finding nothing and getting nowhere. He realized that he had to take a risk and barge into one of the tents. He knew what would happen if he was wrong, but he had no choice. The fires were set, and the Amorites would be making their move soon. He wondered why the Elamites were so slow to respond. "Go into the tents," he told those behind him. "Find the captives." The men split apart and began searching each tent. Cries began to rise as they found the soldiers instead, and a fierce melee began to break out. But, to Abram's surprise, few of the Elamite soldiers were armed, and some were barely even dressed. Yet even so, there were enough half-naked Elamites with spears to give the fully clad Hebrew warriors a sound fight. Even Abram had to get his hands dirty to protect his servants at times. Slowly but surely, they made their way deeper into the camp. They were approaching one of the larger tents. Abram feared to enter this one, for he guessed that it belonged to a captain of the hosts, if not one of the kings themselves. To the right, there was a smaller tent, which Abram approached and pushed aside the doors of the tent. Before him, he saw not a band of unclad Elamite soldiers, but many men bound and gagged. He went among them, cutting their bonds with his knife. He looked in their faces, hoping to find Lot among them. But there was none among them whom he recognized. At the end of the group, he found one of Lot's servants. "My lord," the servant said, as Abram cut the gag out of his mouth. "Where is your master?" Abram asked. "He is in one of the other tents nearby," the servant replied. "Come with us," Abram said. He took the servant up and pushed him back into the protection of the others. He then went to the next nearest tent and opened the doors thereof. As soon as he opened it, he saw one of the prisoners squirming and groaning against his restraints. Running over to him, he saw with amazement that Lot, Ado, and their 4 children were there, bound with the others. He placed his staff down on the ground beside him, drew out his dagger, and cut their bonds. "My lord uncle," Lot gasped, "I never expected to see you here, in this place." "I made an oath, Lot," Abram said. "I couldn't leave you to the mercy of the Elamites." "Behind you!" Lot cried out. While Abram was untying Lot, one of the people whom Abram had taken for a prisoner had risen from among the others and drawn out a sword to stab the old Hebrew in the back. But for Lot's timely suggestion, Abram would have been cut down there and now. But he heard the word, and turning around, noticed the surprised assailant. He rolled aside from the blow, and kicked up from the ground his staff. The hooded assailant threw off his hood, revealing a bald, bearded man in armor, bearing a sword which he pointed at Abram.
"So, this is the great Abram," the man said, "the troubler of Nimrod." "And you are?" Abram asked. "I am Kutil-Lagamur, son of a party," said the man, "and you are a dead man."
Chedorlaomer swung his sword at Abram, who parried the blow with his staff. He swung again, but stopped short as Abram held up his staff to defend himself. This was not as any foe as Abram had yet faced. A warrior trained to fight. To kill. Abram swung his staff at him, but the Elamite king ducked and avoided the head. He played a long game with the Hebrew sheik, hoping to wear out the inexperienced shepherd and move in for the kill when his blows were sluggish and ineffectual. But what he did not expect was that Abram was not as weak as his age made him appear. At 76, he was still as strong as he was at 50, though maybe a little slower in his movement. The king's movements, however, were swift and precise. Whenever Abram swung at him with his staff, he merely moved aside or knocked back his staff with his sword. As the fierce combat wore on, Abram tightly clutched the wood of his staff, refusing to let it go. He knew enough of battle to know that if he dropped his weapon, he was at the mercy of his enemy. Each blow of the Elamite king's sword sent shivers down his staff, yet he refused to give in. Chedorlaomer seemed to take his foe's hesitation for weakness, and laughed at him.
"Ha ha! Is that the best you can do?" he asked. "I've slain children who fought harder than that. I wonder why Nimrod was so afraid of a cowardly goatherd." "Nimrod's behind this?" Abram asked. "Not exactly," Chedorlaomer retorted, sidestepping to pull down one of the tent poles and send the tent down upon him. Abram was able to hold up his staff and keep his front view clear. "This war was about revenge on the Sodomites," the Elamite king replied, "but Amorite insisted that we capture your nephew. His father knew that you would come for him if we captured him, and so you have. Now we'll see if your God can save you from bronze as well as fire." Chedorlaomer swung his sword at Abram, who drove the blow away from him with his staff. Another blow was parried, and now they were outside of the tent, surrounded by the blaze of the burning camp. The work of Abram's servants was nothing if not efficient. All around them was the blaring of horns as the Elamites were assaulted from the south by the Amorite cavalry. And something else as well. But Abram's attention was on the Elamite king, who was eyeing his opponent for weaknesses. He made a high attack feint, then turned the sword no sooner than it had met the staff to slice perpendicular into Abram's head. But the old Hebrew spun his staff and turned the blow again. But where he could not succeed in skill, the Elamite chose to attempt guile to get the upper hand. Kicking his foot into the sand, he sent up a cloud of dust into Abram's eyes, blinding him temporarily. The old man waved his staff about, trying to fend off blows that he knew were coming, while his other hand tried to wipe the sand out of his eyes. Amid this chaos, Chedorlaomer swung his sword to cut down the old man. But at that moment, Sharum, the former prison warden of Nimrod, threw himself between the sword and his master. His staff had been broken against a very powerful Elisarim, and there was no sword or spear on hand to turn the Elamite's blow. The bronze blade bit through clothing and drove through the third rib. Chedorlaomer kicked Sharum down and redoubled his attack. But at that instant, another servant of Abram's put himself between his master and the Elamite. This one, however, bore a knife in his hand and brandished it in the direction of the Elamite king. "You will not harm my master!" Eleazar shouted. "Another servant of this sterile old mule!" the Elamite retorted. He swung his sword at Eleazar, who ducked aside from the blow. "Ha! I've slain giants by the hundreds! What chance do you think you have against me?" He brought his sword to strike Eleazar at the neck, when the staff of Abram came back up and turned the blow. "There is one who is stronger than all the kings and giants of the earth," Abram replied, "one who looks upon the great ones of the sons of men and laughs them all to scorn. It is his servant you fight. And who is this great one?
Chedorlaomer retorted.
The eternal God!
Abram shouted, pressing the attack with his staff. Now Chedorlaomer was fending off blows from the staff with his sword. Seizing a potential opening, the Elamite king sent a thrust towards Abram's stomach. But in that moment, the staff struck his wrist, and his hand dropped the sword. Abram thrust the staff against the Elamite's throat and held him to the ground.
Be gone, and trouble these lands no more,
Abram said. He then took the staff from the Elamite's neck and turned about to see his nephew Lot. But Chedorlaomer was not yet beaten. He reached for his knife that rested upon his belt and charged at Abram. Eleazar, who had stood aside while his master engaged the enemy again, threw himself between the Elamite and his master, taking the knife into his lower back. Abram heard the cry and turned about, seeing his beloved servant, his potential heir, groaning in pain under Chedorlaomer's knife. Abram put down his staff, took up his knife, and charged the Elamite king. Quickly he seized Chedorlaomer by the beard and thrust his blade deep into the Elamite's neck. A bloody death, but a quick one. As the body of the Elamite fell to the ground, Abram noticed that something else was coming up through the camp of the Elamites from the south. Turning thither, his mouth hung open in wide amazement. There, striding through the camp of the Elamites, were Amorite soldiers nearly 10 cubits in height. Each one bore spears and clubs, easily the size of trees, yet they barely needed any weapon other than their sheer size and strength. These made havoc of the armies of the Elamites, for none of them dared to stand toe-to-toe with a single giant, much less 6 of them. Abram turned away from the giants. Though he had known Noah and Nimrod, seeing these things which towered over them was enough to fill his heart with dread. Though he never had reason to doubt the Eternal for his righteousness, he saw now that he was vindicated with the deluge. If only 6 could fill his heart with dread, he dared not imagine a world full of such giants, all of them violent and godless. Turning from that, he noticed in the flickering glow of the distant flames the body of Eleazar lying on the ground before him.
Eleazar!
He cried out. Kneeling, he lifted his chief servant up off the ground and examined the stab wound. It was in his lower back, but hadn't pierced his lungs.
Lie there. You're going to be fine. It was my honor,
Eleazar replied.
To die for you. You're not going to die,
Abram told his servant.
You're going to live. Do you hear me? I forbid you to die. Why not?
Eleazar asked.
What greater honor is there than to serve my Lord by my death? Because I'm making you my heir,
Abram replied.
Yes, don't you see? Through you the promise of the eternal God may be fulfilled, so you cannot die.
He removed his keshe, and then, lifting Eleazar off the ground, wrapped his wound with his scarf from his head.
There now.
This will help you until we can properly bind the wound.
Uncle!
Lot's voice cried out. Abram had quite forgotten about his nephew. Lot was standing nearby, amid the group of the servants of the house of Abram. The older man turned about to his nephew, a look of relief upon his face. He ran over to him and threw his arms about him in a warm embrace, planting a kiss on each of his cheeks.
Praise be the eternal God who has given us the victory,
Abram lauded.
I knew you would come for me, Lot returned. My servants fretted when the Elamites plundered Sodom, but I told them all, my lord uncle is a man of his word. He'll come for us.
At that moment, a horseman rode up to the small group. The servants drew their spears and staves, ready to ward off an assault. But the one on the horse was Mamre. His sword was drawn in his hand and dripping with blood. There was blood splattered upon his face, which was marked with a grin.
Abram, he greeted. We've got them on the run. A glorious victory this night.
Abram nodded, but did not agree with him in his heart. The midnight air was filled with fire, cries of the dying and wounded, and the stench of burning flesh.
he could not see any glory in such a thing, no honor in it.
They're fleeing to the northwest, into the mountains, Mamre said. We cannot let them regroup, or they'll turn and annihilate us. We must give pursuit.
The mountains would be a fine place for them to set a trap, Abram replied.
Not for them, no, Mamre retorted. They're on the run. They have no time to plan traps for us. Besides, we know this land better than them. While they're entangled trying to cross the mountains, we pick them off at leisure from the shepherd's passes. Come, quickly, before they take the high ground. Haste is needed.
Mamre cracked the reins of his horse and took off into the burning camp. Abram, meanwhile, had more than himself to worry about. He had to bring the captives to safety, as well as assess the strength of his own host. Quickly they made their way through the chaos of the battle towards the southern end of the camp. The Elamites were in disarray, and so they gave them little resistance. The real problem was getting through the line of the Amorites. Abram particularly steered clear of the giants, for they might strike him without care, having no regard for any law or covenants. What giant would fear either God or man, when all men bowed down in fear before them all the days of their lives? Once they broke free from the battle, Abram brought his nephew and the other captives to the town of Lisha. Those of his number had brought back Eleazar, borne in their arms on account of his wound. There was no wall until they passed into the town without much resistance. The people had locked their doors and hid themselves from the coming of the Elamites. At the door of a mud brick house, Abram left his nephew and the other captives and took a quick census of his men. Of the 318 he took with him from Kiryat Arba, 10 had been slain. Sharum, one of the eldest servants and earliest converts to the Eternal from Abram's time in Ur, had fallen at the hand of Chedorlaomer. Of those who were still alive, another 60 were wounded, among them Eleazar the Damasek. It was 208 that Abram took with him to rejoin the battle with the Amorites. Many of them were the younger servants, those who were born in Padan, or shortly before the arrival. The battle continued for another several days, with smaller skirmishes taking place throughout the mountain range of Senir. While the Amorite cavalry were hampered by the upward climb, Abram's footmen were much more able to take point and rain down arrows, javelins, and rocks upon the Elamites below them. The giants were not perturbed by the mountainous regions, but betook themselves with as much savagery as in the valley. In contrast, the Elamite army had been armed to the hilt with horses, men on camels, and even war wagons, the chariot. These made the progress uphill even slower for them, and gave their pursuers the chance to pick them off at their leisure. Many dead were strewn along the mountains, a feast for the ravens and vultures of that land. Sometimes a bold captain would have his men turn and try to assault the pursuers, and even strike a few casualties. But the losses that he suffered were much more severe, and he was forced to quit the sortie or surrender his life. Day after day the battle continued, over the hills in the land of Senir. At length, however, what was left of the enemy arrived at a small walled city several miles west of Damascus. Here the pursuit ended, for the city of Hoba was within 2 days' march of Baalbek, from where fresh reinforcements could arrive to succor the Elamite army. They had passed out of the land of Canaan, and were now entering the land of Nimrod. With one accord they decided to leave off the pursuit, and return to Canaan to see to their dead and the captives. All told, 3 of Abraham's servants died in the pursuit. 40 were wounded, including Abram himself, who had taken a blow from the edge of a Hurrian shield to his forehead. His head was bandaged by his servants, who took him away from the battle in fear that the blow had slain him. Even when he responded to them, they refused to let him go until they had cleaned the blood from his head and bound the wound. The Amorites had similar losses, including 2 of the 6 giants. One had thrown himself into the midst of the Elasarim, and had been so pierced, hacked, and bludgeoned by their weapons that he left a river of blood behind him, until at last he fell to the ground in death. By now, word had gotten out from Lisha of the rout of the 4 kings by Abram the Hebrew. As the story spread, it grew even larger and more incredible with each telling. First, it was of a desert prince who smote the Elamites in a skilled nightly attack with a band of the giant Amorites and his own servants. Then it was said that only Abram the Hebrew went to battle, and smote the Elamites single-handedly. Now it was that Abram was a giant himself, as tall as 70 men with a stride of 1 league and a third thereof. While yet others said that Abram was to be crowned the king and god of this land in recognition of his valor. Little of this reached Abram as he and his men returned to Laisha from the battle. At the site of the former camp, Abram found those 60 he had left behind busy at work. The camp was burned, but these hardy ones, wounded though they were, plundered the Elamite camp, and brought all the goods back to the town of Laisha, and there kept guard over them. Upon his return, the final account of his losses were recorded. 2 of those who remained behind had died of their wounds, as well as 3 of those who went with Abram to the assault. All told, 18 men had died, and 1/3 were wounded, among them Abram and Eleazar. In gratitude for his deliverance, Lot and Oddo and those of his house took from the plunder to give to Abram and his soldiers for food and drink. Abram refused, citing his oath with the Eternal. The servants, however, did not follow the example of their master and took food and drink for themselves. Abram did not chide them, nor forbid them from doing so. They had come a long way, and had eaten little, and some of them were wounded badly. In due time, Mamre and his brothers arrived at Laisha. In their wake, a multitude of curiosity seekers, and those who came to praise and exalt Abram. These began to flock to the town in so great numbers that Abram decided that it was time to leave. So his servants took the wagons they had taken from the camp of the Elamites, and loaded the goods, women, children, and wounded onto those wagons, and began the 5-day journey from Laisha to the cities of the plain. But while they were preparing to leave, even as Abram stood at the door of the mud brick house, and tried to pay the keeper of the house for any damages that his servants might have done to them while they remained, there appeared a lone figure riding up out of the south on a donkey. The man's clothing was most ordinary, yet he bore himself like a king freshly come from the victory. At the entrance of the house, the man stopped his donkey and dismounted. Abram approached to meet him.
"Peace be upon you, sir," Abram greeted. "The peace of the Most High God be with you, Abram son of Terah," the man returned. "You know of the Eternal?" Abram asked. The stranger nodded and continued to make his approach. "Was it not asked of you, does the Eternal have priests in his service?" They now stood close enough that Abram could accurately see the man. He seemed not very old, or perhaps he had the blood of Noah in him and aged slowly. His hair hung down to his shoulders and was dark of color like his beard. There was something in his eyes, however, that brought a strange kind of peace to Abram, a peace that he had not experienced in the presence of any one person. "Behold, Abram," the man said, "I am Melchizedek, king of righteousness and priest of the Most High God." "My lord," Abram said, bending down to his knees and lowering his head. Melchizedek now stood by Abram, and, placing his left hand upon the old man's gray head, lifted the right hand to heaven, with fingers in the votive gesture. Fingers spread apart in a V shape, with the thumb pressed in the midst of them. "Blessed be Abram, servant of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth," Melchizedek blessed. "And blessed be the Most High God, who has delivered thine enemies into thy hand." Once the blessing had been said, Melchizedek took Abram by the hand and lifted him back up onto his feet. "Come, I bring bread and wine for your nourishment. Bravely have you fought, and now let your fasting be ended, and may your heart be filled with gladness. And I," Abram added, "shall pay you a tithe of all that I possess that is under my hand." The next several days were much more hectic than the first day of the setting out. Having accepted the tithe, Melchizedek bade Abram farewell, and told him never to cease from praying and sacrificing to the Eternal, whom he called the Most High. He remarked especially that Abram owed the Most High thanks for the victory that he had given him. And so, with camels and wagons in tow, Melchizedek mounted his donkey and rode off into the mists of time. But the farther south Abram went, the worse it became. Soon there was a small crowd always about them, crying after Abram, proclaiming him as their king and God. He dismissed these and told them that the eternal God alone was the king of the world. This few paid any attention to, for the lion's share of those who followed after him
were the peoples of the cities of the plain. These had hid themselves in the caves of the mountains after the slaughter in the Wadi Shittim, and now that victory had been won, they showed themselves, hoping to enter into the good graces of the victor. When they came to the king's valley, a royal procession was standing before them. The Amorite chieftains gathered about Abram, as if they could protect him from the armed guards before them. The guards divided into 2 rows, and a golden throne appeared from their midst. The throne was carried on poles by 14 slaves, 7 on each side. Before the throne walked 10 more slaves in 2 long rows of 5s extending to the sides of the throne. Atop the throne was a woman dressed in purple and scarlet silk, with her arms, shoulders, hands, and head decked with gold, precious stones, and pearls. "You are Abram the Hebrew, are you not?" she asked.
"I am,"
Abram nodded. "I am Bera, ruler of the great city of Sodom," the woman announced. Abram seemed taken aback.
"A woman?"
Queen Bera smirked. "But of course, you are an ignorant shepherd from the wilderness. You are not familiar with the customs of civilization. Nevertheless, we are indebted to you for your bravery. You have smitten the Elamites and brought back all that they plundered from our fair cities. As a token of our esteem, return to us all the men, women, and children, and you may take your choice of reward from the goods of our city that you have recovered."
"Your Highness," Abram replied, "I thank you for your generosity, but I cannot accept anything of yours."
"What?" Bera chuckled, slightly amused with the reply. "You will take nothing?" Abram then raised up his right hand, leaning upon his staff with his left hand.
"As the Eternal lives, the Most High God, possessor and creator of heaven and earth, who redeemed my soul from affliction and has this day delivered mine enemies into my hand, I shall take nothing of yours, be it as small as a thread or the strap of a sandal."
Mamre leaned in and whispered into Abram's right ear.
"What are you doing? My brothers and I did not agree to forfeiting our reward."
Bera let out a loud and slightly mocking laugh. "What a strange god you worship, who denies you the just spoils of victory. Perhaps that is why you remain a sterile old mule yet, if the rumors are indeed true."
"The Eternal has promised to bless the works of my hands,"
Abram replied, dismissing the queen's snide remark.
"That I shall lack for nothing. Therefore, in exchange for victory, I lifted up my hand to him and vowed to take nothing that was not mine. It is the Eternal who shall make me rich, and no prince, whether man or woman." "Abram," Mamre hissed. "Although, if I may speak this yet," Abram added, "my servants have taken food and drink for themselves, for they are weary from the long journey and battle. Let them have that. Also my noble allies, Mamre, Ishkal, and Aner, princes of the Amorites. Let them choose a reward for themselves."
Mamre heaved a sigh of relief. Then he and his brothers stepped in front of Abram, curtly nodded before Bera, and began to make their choice of a reward. Abram, meanwhile, had turned back to his nephew and embraced him. "Farewell, Lot," he said. "May the days ahead of you be full of peace."
"And you as well, my lord uncle,"
Lot replied.
"Perhaps there is some truth indeed in what you have believed and taught these 27 years."
"There is indeed," Abram said with a smile on his face.
"Now go and tell the Sodomites of the Eternal."
He embraced Lot and planted a kiss on his cheeks one last time, and then turned back to his servants.
"My lord," Eleazar interjected, "the other servants are saying that those who remained in Lisha have no part of the reward." "That shall not be," Abram said. "Those who remained and guarded the recovered goods and people did no less an honorable task than those who engaged the Elamites. They shall have all the food and water from the plunder after their desire."
The story continues in chapter 15.